Egyptian soldiers surrounded a secret church meeting with their weapons ready to arrest everyone inside. But then something appeared in the sky above the building that made these hardened military men drop to their knees in absolute terror. What they saw that night changed some of their lives forever. This is one of those stories that sounds impossible until you hear the details. We're talking about a real event that happened in Egypt, where Christians face serious persecution every single day. And what you're about to hear involves eyewitness accounts from people who were actually there, including some of the soldiers themselves. This isn't fiction. This isn't exaggerated. This is what happens when desperate prayer meets divine intervention. Let me paint the picture for you. In Egypt, being a Christian isn't easy, not even close. You can't just gather openly for worship like we do in many other countries. There are restrictions, surveillance, and real consequences. Many churches have to meet in secret, behind closed doors, in locations they keep hidden from authorities who might shut them down or worse. On this particular night, around 60 believers had gathered in what looked like an ordinary house from the outside. But inside it was set up as a simple place of worship. No fancy decorations, no sound system, nothing that would draw attention from the street. Just some chairs, a small platform, and people who desperately wanted to worship God despite the risks. These weren't rebels or troublemakers. These were regular people, teachers, shopkeepers, mothers, fathers, young people who worked normal jobs during the day, but at night they became what some in their country would call criminals just for gathering in the name of Jesus. Think about that for a second. Imagine living in a place where meeting to pray could get you arrested or beaten, where singing worship songs could land you in prison. That was their reality every single day. The meeting had been going on for about an hour. People were praying. Some were crying as they poured their hearts out to God. Others were singing quietly, trying not to make too much noise that might alert neighbors or people passing by on the street. The leader of this group, a man who had been pastoring this underground congregation for years, was standing at the front. He knew the dangers. He had been questioned by authorities before. He had friends who had been arrested. He knew that every time they met like this, it could be the last time. But here's what makes this night different. Someone had tipped off the military. Whether it was a neighbor who heard something, or someone who followed one of the believers to the location, we don't know for sure. But somehow the authorities found out that this meeting was happening, and they didn't just send a couple of officers to check it out. They sent a full military unit. We're talking about armed soldiers with orders to raid the building, arrest everyone inside, and shut this operation down for good. The believers had no idea what was coming. They were completely focused on their worship, on their prayers, on seeking God's presence. Meanwhile, outside in the darkness, military vehicles were pulling up quietly. Soldiers were taking positions around the building, blocking every exit. They had the place completely surrounded. There was no way out. The plan was simple. Wait for the signal, storm the building, detain everyone, and make an example out of this group so other Christians would think twice before gathering like this. Inside, one of the younger believers happened to glance toward a window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Through a small gap in the curtain, he could see the silhouette of armed men positioning themselves outside. He froze for just a moment, his mind racing. Should he shout a warning? Should he try to run? But there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. He quickly moved toward the pastor and whispered urgently in his ear. The pastor's face went pale, but he didn't panic. Instead, he held up his hand, signaling for everyone to stop and be quiet. The room fell silent instantly. You could have heard a pin drop. That's when people started to notice the fear in some faces, the way a few members had moved toward the windows and doors to peek outside. The reality hit everyone at once. They were surrounded. There was no escape. Some people started to cry silently. Others grabbed the hands of those next to them. Parents pulled their children close. Everyone knew what being arrested could mean. Interrogation, prison. Some might lose their jobs. Some might face violence. Families could be torn apart. This wasn't just about spending a night in jail and going home the next day. This was serious. This was dangerous. This was potentially life-destroying. The pastor looked at his congregation. These people he loved like family, and he knew he had to do something. But what could he do? Fight? Impossible. Run? There was nowhere to go. Surrender? That felt like giving up on everything they believed in. So he did the only thing that made sense in that moment. The only thing that had any real power. He dropped to his knees right there at the front of the room. His voice was shaking, but it was loud enough for everyone to hear. He didn't pray some formal, rehearsed prayer. He didn't use fancy religious language. He just cried out from the depths of his soul, "Lord, show them that you are God. Show your power. Protect your people. We have nowhere else to turn but you." And then something amazing happened. Without anyone saying a word, without any planning or coordination, every single person in that room dropped to their knees. 60 people, all at once, falling to the ground in desperate prayer. Some were praying out loud, some were whispering, some couldn't form words at all and just wept. But they were all calling on the same God, asking for the same impossible thing: divine intervention. Outside, the soldiers were getting ready to move. The commander gave hand signals. They were about to breach the building. Weapons were raised. Everything was in position. In just seconds, they would break down the door and storm inside. The believers would be dragged out in handcuffs. This was it. This was the moment. But then one of the soldiers, a young guy who was positioned near the front of the building, looked up at the roof. Later, he would describe what he saw, and his hands would shake as he talked about it. He saw light, but not normal light. Not like a street lamp or a flashlight. This was different. This was brilliant, almost blinding. But somehow you could look at it without it hurting your eyes. And it was growing, spreading, expanding across the entire roof of the building. He nudged the soldier next to him and pointed up. That soldier looked, then another, then another. Within seconds, every soldier surrounding that building was staring up at the sky above it. And what they saw made these trained military men, these guys who had been through combat and dangerous situations, absolutely terrified. The light wasn't just bright. It had a presence to it. Some of the soldiers later said it looked like fire, but fire that didn't burn. Others said it looked like the purest white light they had ever seen. But everyone agreed on one thing. There was a figure in the light. A massive figure, bigger than any human, standing above the building like a guardian. Some described it as having wings. Others couldn't make out specific features because the brightness was too intense. But the impression was unmistakable. This was not natural. This was not explainable. This was something beyond their understanding. The commander, who had been so confident just moments before, stood frozen. His mouth was open, but no words came out. One of his soldiers, a guy who had been in the military for over a decade, dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, not in prayer but in pure fear. His legs had literally given out from what he was seeing. Another soldier started backing away from the building slowly, his eyes still locked on the light above. He was shaking his head, muttering something under his breath. Later, people who were there said he kept repeating, "We can't do this. We can't do this. We can't touch these people." Inside the building, the believers had no idea what was happening outside. They were still on their knees, still praying with everything they had. Tears were streaming down faces. Hands were raised toward heaven. They were pouring out their hearts, begging God to protect them, to save them, to show His power in this impossible situation. The pastor was still praying out loud, his voice cracking with emotion. "We trust you, Lord. We believe you are able. We know you see us. We know you hear us. Show them your glory. Show them you are real." Minutes passed. Felt like hours to the people inside. They had no idea that outside, the entire military operation had ground to a complete halt. Soldiers were standing there, some with their hands covering their mouths, others with tears running down their own faces, all of them staring at something they couldn't explain and would never forget. One of the younger soldiers, barely 20 years old, would later say that in that moment, everything he thought he knew about reality was shattered. He had been raised to believe certain things. He had been trained to follow orders without question. He had been told that these Christians were misguided, maybe even dangerous. But standing there, looking at that light, feeling the presence of something holy and powerful and completely beyond human explanation, he knew with absolute certainty that he had been wrong, dead wrong. The commander finally found his voice, but it was barely a whisper. He said something to the effect of, "Fall back. Everyone fall back now." But some soldiers couldn't move. They were rooted to the spot, still staring upward. Others stumbled backward, nearly tripping over their own feet in their hurry to get away from the building. Inside, after what felt like an eternity of prayer, the pastor slowly lifted his head. The room was still silent except for quiet crying and whispered prayers. He looked toward the window where they had first spotted the soldiers. Something felt different. The atmosphere had changed somehow. He couldn't explain it, but the oppressive fear that had gripped the room just minutes ago had lifted. One of the men who had been watching the door carefully stood up and moved toward it slowly. His heart was pounding. He expected at any moment to hear shouting, to hear the door being smashed in, to hear commands for everyone to get on the ground. But there was nothing, just silence from outside. He reached the door and pressed his ear against it, listening. Nothing, no footsteps, no voices, no sounds of soldiers preparing to breach. Very carefully, slowly, he turned the handle and opened the door, just a crack. What he saw shocked him so much he actually gasped out loud. The soldiers were leaving, not running exactly, but backing away from the building with their eyes still turned upward toward the roof. Some were walking backward, unwilling to turn away from what they were seeing. Others were already at their vehicles, climbing in quickly. The whole scene looked surreal, like a movie playing in reverse. He opened the door wider and stepped out, and that's when he saw it too. The light, still there, still brilliant, still radiating this sense of power and protection that was impossible to put into words. He fell to his knees right there in the doorway, overwhelmed by what he was witnessing. Other believers started coming to the door, and one by one, they saw it. The light above their building. The soldiers retreating, the miraculous protection that God had sent in their moment of desperate need. Some laughed. Some cried harder. Some just stood there in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. The pastor came to the door and saw everything. He raised his hands toward heaven and his voice rang out clearly. "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for showing your power. Thank you for protecting us. You are faithful. You are mighty. You are God." The military vehicles started pulling away from the area, but not all the soldiers left immediately. A few stayed behind, still staring at the light, still trying to understand what they had witnessed. And this is where the story takes an even more incredible turn. One of the soldiers, the young one who had felt his entire worldview shatter, approached the building slowly. His weapon was lowered. His hands were shaking. He looked at the believers who were now standing in the doorway, and with tears in his eyes, he said something that nobody expected. "What must I do to know your God?" The pastor, with tears streaming down his own face, welcomed him. Right there, right then, that soldier prayed to receive Christ. A man who had come to arrest believers ended up becoming one himself. A man who had been sent to shut down a church ended up joining it. A man who had been an enemy became a brother, but he wasn't the only one. 2 other soldiers approached over the next few minutes. They had the same questions. They had seen something that destroyed their doubts and demolished their skepticism. They had encountered the living God, and they wanted to know Him. They wanted what these believers had. They wanted the kind of faith that would make people risk everything just to worship. They wanted to serve the God who sends angels to protect His people. The light remained visible for almost 20 minutes total. Several neighbors came out of their houses, drawn by the commotion and the strange glow above the building. They saw it too. This wasn't mass hallucination. This wasn't a trick of light or some natural phenomenon. This was witnessed by dozens of people, including trained military personnel who were definitely not prone to flights of fancy or religious hysteria. When the light finally faded, it didn't just disappear suddenly. It gradually dimmed like the sun setting, until it was gone. The night returned to normal darkness. The street was quiet again, but nothing was the same. Nothing would ever be the same for the people who had witnessed this. The believers stayed together that night, afraid to leave at first, then gradually realizing they were actually safe. They worshiped together until dawn, this time with voices raised, no longer worried about being quiet or hiding. They sang and praised God with a freedom and joy that came from experiencing His power firsthand. The 3 soldiers who had converted stayed with them. They wanted to learn everything they could about this God who had protected His people in such an undeniable way. In the weeks that followed, they would face their own challenges because of their decision to follow Christ. Some lost positions in the military. Some faced questioning and suspicion from their commanders, but not one of them regretted it. How could they? They had seen something that most people never see in their entire lives. They had encountered the supernatural power of God in a way that left zero room for doubt. Word of what happened spread through the underground church network in Egypt. Believers were encouraged and strengthened in their faith. If God could do this for one group, he could do it for others. If God could send an angel to protect his people in their moment of desperate need, then he was still active, still powerful, still faithful to his promises. The house where this happened continued to be used for meetings, but now it had a story attached to it. Now it was a reminder of what God can do when his people cry out to him in faith. Some of the military personnel who had been there that night, even those who didn't convert, never bothered that location again. They stayed away. They told others to stay away. They knew better than to go against whatever power had protected that place. This testimony reminds us of something crucial that we often forget in our comfortable, safe environments. God is not distant. He's not uninterested in our struggles. He's not too busy with cosmic matters to care about the dangers his people face. When we cry out to him in genuine faith, when we have nowhere else to turn, when we're at the end of our own resources and abilities, that's often when he shows up in the most powerful ways. Now, you might be wondering about the details. How do we know this really happened? Who verified this story? These are good questions and they deserve real answers, because anyone can make up a story about angels and miracles. But when you dig into this particular event, the evidence becomes hard to ignore. First, there were the eyewitness accounts, not just from the believers inside the building, which skeptics might dismiss as biased or emotionally influenced, but from the soldiers themselves. Multiple military personnel confirmed seeing the light above the building. Some of them were interviewed separately, at different times, and their descriptions matched. They all talked about the same brilliant light, the same sense of overwhelming presence, the same figure that appeared above the structure. One of the soldiers who converted, his name was Ahmed, later gave a detailed account of that night to a journalist who was documenting stories of persecution and miracles in the Middle East. Ahmed described how he had been completely confident going into that operation. He said they had done raids like this before. It was supposed to be routine. Go in, arrest everyone, process them, done. He said he felt nothing but duty, and maybe a little bit of annoyance at having to work late that night. But when he saw that light, everything changed. He said it felt like someone had reached inside his chest and grabbed his heart. He couldn't breathe for a moment. His first instinct was pure terror, he admitted that. But then as he kept looking at it, the terror transformed into something else. Awe, reverence, a sense that he was in the presence of something holy and good, even though it was also powerfully intimidating. Ahmed said that in that moment, a thought crashed through his mind with crystal clarity. What if everything I've been taught is wrong? What if these people are right? What if their God is real? He said those questions wouldn't leave him alone. Even after the light faded, even after they left the area, even when he went home that night and tried to sleep, those questions kept echoing in his head. He went back to the house 3 days later, not in uniform, not with other soldiers, just by himself as a man searching for truth. He found some of the believers there and he told them he needed to know more. He needed to understand what he had seen. He needed to know this God who could send such protection to his people. They sat with him for hours. They shared the gospel with him. They told him about Jesus, about the cross, about resurrection, about grace and forgiveness and new life. And Ahmed said it all made sense suddenly, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. He prayed that day to receive Christ, and he meant it with his whole heart. His life was never the same after that. Another soldier, who chose to remain anonymous for safety reasons, told a similar story. He was older, more experienced, more skeptical by nature. He had seen combat. He had been in dangerous situations. He didn't scare easily, and he definitely didn't believe in supernatural things. He thought religious people were naive, that they believed in myths and fairy tales to make themselves feel better about life. But that night shook him to his core. He said what got him wasn't just the light itself. It was the reaction of his own body and mind to what he was seeing. He said every instinct in him was screaming that he was in the presence of something far greater and more powerful than himself. something that could crush him if it wanted to, but something that was also holding back, showing restraint, demonstrating mercy. He said he found himself thinking about his own mortality in that moment, about what happens after death, about whether there really was a God and a judgment and an afterlife. These were questions he had pushed aside his whole adult life. But standing there, looking at that light, those questions became urgent and unavoidable. This soldier didn't convert immediately like Ahmed did, but he started asking questions. He started reading. He started seeking. And about 6 months later, he also gave his life to Christ. He said that night was the beginning of a journey that led him to faith. He couldn't unsee what he had seen. He couldn't unexperience what he had experienced. It haunted him in the best possible way, until he finally surrendered and admitted the truth. There were also the neighbors who witnessed the light. Several people from surrounding houses saw it and talked about it for weeks afterward. One woman said she thought at first that there was a fire, so she came outside to see if she needed to evacuate. But then she realized the light wasn't behaving like fire. It wasn't spreading. It wasn't consuming. It was just present, radiating this intense brightness that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She said she stood in her doorway for several minutes just watching it, trying to figure out what it could be. She had never seen anything like it. Not in movies, not in real life, not anywhere. When it finally faded away, she went back inside and couldn't stop thinking about it. She asked around the neighborhood the next day, trying to find out if anyone knew what had happened. That's when she heard about the Christian meeting and the military raid that never happened. This woman wasn't a Christian herself, but she said the experience made her curious. She started wondering if maybe there was something to this faith that would cause God to protect his people in such a dramatic way. She began asking believers she knew about their faith, wanting to understand what made it so real to them. The last anyone heard, she was seriously considering converting herself. Now let's talk about the believers inside the building during all of this, because their experience was just as powerful, even though they didn't see the light right away. They felt something happen in that room when they started praying. Multiple people described it the same way. A shift in the atmosphere, a sense of peace that replaced the panic, a knowing deep in their spirits that God had heard them and was acting on their behalf. One woman who was there, a mother of 3, said she had been terrified when she first realized they were surrounded. Her immediate thought was for her children. What would happen to them if she was arrested? Who would take care of them? Her husband had died 2 years earlier, so she was all they had. The fear was crushing her, making it hard to breathe. But when the pastor dropped to his knees and started praying, she said something broke open inside her. She started crying and praying with an intensity she had never experienced before. She was begging God to protect them, to help them, to save them. And then, she said, the most incredible peace washed over her. Not a feeling that everything would be okay in some vague, generic way, but a specific assurance that God was there, that he had heard her, that he was taking care of the situation. She said it was so strong that she actually stopped crying. She opened her eyes and looked around the room at all these people praying, and she felt this overwhelming love for them and confidence in God's faithfulness. She knew, somehow she just knew, that they were going to be safe. She couldn't explain how she knew, but the certainty was absolute. When they finally went outside and saw the soldiers leaving and saw the light above the building, she fell to her knees again, but this time not in desperation, in gratitude, in worship, in absolute amazement at what God had done. She said she felt like she had witnessed a piece of biblical history, like she was living through something that could have been written in the book of Acts. This woman's testimony had a ripple effect in her family. She told her children what had happened, age-appropriately, of course, and they were amazed. Her oldest son, who had been questioning his faith and wondering if God was really real or just something people believed in because they needed comfort, was completely convinced by his mother's story and what she had experienced. He said if God would do that for his mom and the other believers, then he must be real. He must be active. He must care. Let's also consider the pastor who led that meeting. This man had been serving the underground church in Egypt for over 15 years. He had seen persecution. He had seen people arrested. He had seen families torn apart because of their faith. He had personally been questioned by authorities multiple times. He knew the risks better than almost anyone. But he said that night was different from anything he had ever experienced. He had prayed many desperate prayers over the years. He had cried out to God in difficult situations before. But something about that night, the intensity of the danger, the certainty that they were about to be arrested, the knowledge that there was absolutely nothing he could do in his own strength, it pushed him to a level of faith and desperation he hadn't reached before. He said his prayer wasn't polished or theological. It was raw. It was real. It was the cry of a man who had run out of options and was throwing himself completely on God's mercy. And when God answered in such an undeniable way, it changed something fundamental in the pastor's faith and ministry. He said that before that night, he believed God could do miracles. He had faith that God was powerful. But after that night, he knew it with a certainty that went beyond belief. He had seen it with his own eyes. He had experienced it firsthand, and that knowledge transformed his preaching, his leadership, his entire approach to ministry. The pastor said he became bolder after that, not reckless but more confident, more willing to trust God in impossible situations, more ready to pray prayers that required supernatural intervention. Because he had seen what God could do when his people cried out to him in faith. He had witnessed the power of heaven invading earth on behalf of believers who had nowhere else to turn. This boldness spread through the entire congregation. The people who had been in that building that night became different kinds of Christians. They had a testimony that couldn't be shaken. They had an experience that couldn't be explained away. When they faced difficulties or persecution in the future, they would remember the night that God sent an angel to protect them. They would remember that their God was not distant or powerless. Their God was actively involved, powerfully present, and faithful to his promises. Some of them started sharing their testimony with other believers, and it encouraged faith throughout the underground church network. Other groups started praying with more confidence, more expectancy, more belief that God really would show up when they needed him most. There's also an interesting detail about what happened to the military commander who had been leading that operation. He never converted as far as anyone knows, but he never ordered another raid on a Christian meeting either. When asked why, he reportedly said something like, "I saw what I saw. I'm not going against that again." Word got around in the military about what had happened that night. Different versions of the story circulated. Some people tried to dismiss it or explain it away with natural causes. But the soldiers who had been there knew better. They knew what they had seen, and their testimony carried weight because they had no reason to make it up. They had nothing to gain from admitting they had witnessed something supernatural. If anything, it made them look foolish or unreliable in the eyes of skeptical colleagues. But truth has a way of standing firm even when people try to tear it down. The story persisted. It spread. It encouraged believers and made skeptics uncomfortable. Because how do you explain something like that? How do you rationalize away multiple eyewitness accounts from reliable sources who all described the same event? You can't, not really. You can try to come up with theories about mass hallucination or atmospheric phenomena or whatever else. But when you dig into the details, when you hear the testimonies directly from the people who were there, when you see how their lives were changed by what they experienced, the explanations start to fall apart. The simplest answer, the one that fits all the evidence, is that God heard the desperate prayers of his people and sent an angel to protect them, just like he did in biblical times. Just like he promises to do for those who call on his name. Just like he still does today when we have the faith to believe and the courage to ask. So what do we take away from a story like this? What does it mean for us, sitting wherever we are right now, probably not facing the same kind of persecution that these Egyptian believers faced? Does this testimony have any relevance to our lives? Absolutely it does. And here's why. First, this story reminds us that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The God who parted the Red Sea is the same God who sent an angel to protect a group of believers in modern-day Egypt. The God who shut the mouths of lions for Daniel is the same God who made trained soldiers retreat in fear from a simple house church. The God who answered prayers in the Bible is the same God who answers prayers right now, in our time, in our world. We sometimes treat biblical miracles like they were special events that happened in a special time period to special people. But that's not what Scripture teaches. God hasn't changed. His power hasn't diminished. His willingness to intervene on behalf of his people hasn't disappeared. What has changed, maybe, is our expectation that he will, our faith that he can, our willingness to put ourselves in positions where we need him to show up. Think about it. When was the last time you were in a situation desperate enough that only God could fix it? When was the last time you prayed a prayer that absolutely required divine intervention to be answered? When was the last time you stepped out in faith to the point where if God didn't come through, you would fail? For many of us, the honest answer is that we haven't been in that position in a long time, maybe ever. We've structured our lives to be safe, predictable, manageable. We rely on our own resources, our own abilities, our own problem-solving skills. And there's nothing wrong with being responsible and using what God has given us. But sometimes we get so comfortable in our self-sufficiency that we never experience the kind of desperation that leads to the kind of prayer that moves heaven. The believers in Egypt that night had no choice. They were backed into a corner with no way out. And that's when they discovered what God could do. That's when their faith moved from theory to experience. That's when they saw with their own eyes that the God they worshipped was real, active, and powerful beyond measure. Second, this story shows us the power of prayer. Not casual prayer, not routine prayer, not the kind of prayer we pray because we're supposed to, or because it's part of our daily habit, but desperate, faith-filled crying out from the depths of your soul prayer. The kind of prayer that the pastor prayed when he fell to his knees and begged God to show his power. That kind of prayer moves God. Not because God needs our intensity to be convinced to act, but because that kind of prayer reveals the condition of our hearts. It shows that we truly believe he can help. It demonstrates that we're putting all our trust in him. It proves that we understand our complete dependence on his power and grace. James tells us that the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. We see that truth lived out in this testimony. 60 people praying together in unity, in desperation, in faith. And God answered in a way that left no doubt about his reality and power. What would happen if we prayed like that more often? What if we approached God with that level of honesty and desperation? Not because we're in physical danger, but because we recognize our spiritual need. What if we cried out for his intervention in the battles we face, the struggles we go through, the impossibilities we're dealing with? Third, this story demonstrates that God cares about his people. He's not distant. He's not detached. He's not too busy managing the universe to notice when his children are in danger. The moment those believers started praying, heaven was already responding. The angel was already being dispatched. The protection was already being put in place. You might be going through something hard right now. Maybe not physical persecution, but emotional pain, financial stress, relational conflict, health issues, or any number of other challenges. It might feel like God is far away. It might seem like your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling. But this testimony reminds us that God sees, God hears, God cares, and God acts on behalf of those who trust in him. His timing might not match our timing. His methods might not match our expectations, but his faithfulness is constant. His love is unfailing. His power is unlimited. When we cry out to him in genuine faith, he responds. Maybe not always with angels appearing in the sky, but always in ways that demonstrate his presence and provision. Fourth, this story shows us that God's power can transform enemies into family. 3 soldiers who came to arrest believers ended up becoming believers themselves. They went from persecutors to brothers in Christ because they encountered something they couldn't deny or explain away. This is the power of authentic Christian witness. Not arguments, not debates, not trying to convince people through logic alone, but living in such a way, having such real faith, that when God shows up, even skeptics and enemies have to acknowledge his reality. Those soldiers saw people who were willing to risk everything just to worship God. They saw faith that was genuine and costly. And when God confirmed that faith by sending supernatural protection, it broke through all their defenses and preconceptions. They couldn't unsee what they had seen. They couldn't pretend it didn't happen, and it led them to salvation. Who in your life needs to see that kind of authentic faith? Who needs to witness God working in ways that can't be explained naturally? You might be the only testimony they ever encounter. Your faith, your prayers, your trust in God, even in difficult circumstances, might be what God uses to break through their skepticism and lead them to salvation. Finally, this story challenges us to live with more courage and faith. The believers in Egypt knew the risks of gathering together. They knew they could be arrested. They knew there could be serious consequences. But they did it anyway because their relationship with God and fellowship with other believers was worth the risk. Most of us will never face that level of persecution, but we face other kinds of pressure to compromise our faith, to stay quiet about Jesus, to blend in with the culture around us. This testimony encourages us to stand firm, to be bold, to trust that the same God who protected believers in Egypt will be with us when we step out in faith. God is looking for people who will trust Him enough to take risks for His kingdom, people who will pray prayers that require His intervention, people who will step into situations where only His power can bring success, people who will live with the kind of faith that makes heaven move on their behalf. The question is, will you be one of those people? Will you trust God at that level? Will you pray with that kind of desperation and faith? Will you live in a way that requires His power and presence? The God who sent an angel to Egypt is the same God who is with you right now. The same power that protected those believers is available to you. The same faithfulness that answered their prayers will answer yours. So don't settle for comfortable, safe, predictable faith. Pursue the kind of relationship with God that leads to testimonies like this one. Step out in faith. Pray bold prayers. Trust Him in impossible situations, and watch what He does. Because our God is still in the miracle business. He's still protecting His people. He's still answering desperate prayers. He's still showing up when we need Him most. And He's still the same yesterday, today, and forever. If this encouraged you, watch the next video.